Hey guys, we've looked at EQ, which is one of the most powerful tools in your arsenal for mixing individual sounds. And you can also apply it to group tracks if you want to. But in this tutorial, I'm going to show you another very powerful weapon that you have in your arsenal for mixing, and that is compression. So here in Audio Effects, we have this device here called a compressor. We'll double click on that to load it up. And you can see that we have this interface that shows ratio, attack time, release time, auto. We have a threshold, we have gain reduction, we have an output level, we have a knee level, and then we have these three different ways to view the interface. We have a makeup switch, peak switch, RMS, expand, and then dry wet. So what do all of these things do? Well, firstly, let me give you an example of what a compressor does. It basically compresses your sounds levels to get all of the levels to be more similar to each other. And this can make a sound seem thicker and more powerful. So to demonstrate this, I'm going to go into my sample library, and we have here a drum loop. I'm going to drag that and drop it into a new track, and I'll solo it. We'll remove this EQ for now. Let's go into Audio Effects and load a compressor, and let's listen to the drum beat looping. And I'm just going to bring the tempo down to 100. So with a drum beat like this, you can see that we have big spikes like the kick drum, the snare, and then we have little spikes, and we also have areas of almost silence, right? So there's a lot of what we call dynamic range, the range between the loudest and the quietest points. And so this type of sound has a lot of dynamic range, and we can reduce that dynamic range. How do we do that? Well, we can bring down this threshold level here. See, as I bring down that threshold level, you start to see some gain reduction kicking in. So what is happening when I bring down that threshold level? Well, let's go into this view here. This is more of a classic view that you might see in a compressor. This shows quite clearly what is happening. Think about signal coming into your compressor and then signal coming out of your compressor. What we're doing is we're saying signal that comes into your compressor is coming in at a certain level, and that level is changing throughout this loop. Some of the levels are very high, some of the levels are very low, almost silence, as we discussed. So this is the threshold level. Right now it's set to minus 25.5 decibels, and what the compressor does is it says whenever any signal that comes into me gets above minus 25.5 dB, I'm going to compress any energy levels that come above there. So any signal over minus 25.5 decibels, I'm going to compress it at a ratio of 2 to 1. So that means for every 2 decibels you put into me above minus 25.5 dB, I'm going to give you only 1 decibel out. If you put 8 decibels into me above minus 25.5 dB, I'm going to put out only 4 of them because I'm working at a ratio of 2 to 1. That's what your compressor is saying. That's why we're seeing this gain reduction. Bringing the threshold to 0, none of this sound is clipping or going over 0 dB, so the compressor is not doing anything. That's why we're seeing no gain reduction here. As we bring this down, it's really thickening up the sound. We can change this ratio. So if I set this ratio to 4 to 1, which is quite extreme, it's now saying, let's change that threshold to minus 25. So once the signal that comes into this compressor goes above minus 25 dB, the compressor is only going to give you 1 decibel out for every 4 decibels you put into it. That's quite extreme compression there. We have attack and release times. The attack time dictates how much time it takes for this compressor to reach that ratio of 4:1 after we cross that threshold. So a slower attack time, say 50 milliseconds, means that it's going to take 50 milliseconds after we cross this threshold for this compressor to get to that ratio of 4:1. And that means that we're going to let through a lot of these initial spikes, these transients here. They're going to pass through uncompressed virtually until the compressor kicks in after 50 milliseconds and starts compressing the remainder of that transient. See, with a very quick attack time, the compressor kicks in instantly and we don't hear any of these spikes coming through. As we increase that attack time, we're getting a lot of punch there. You can also see here that we're going into the red. We're clipping over 0 dB. So we're going to bring down that output level. We also have release time. So once the signal is fully compressed, how much time is it going to take to release that compression? It's going to take 50 milliseconds. After the signal comes back down below this threshold of minus 25 dB, it's going to take 50 milliseconds for it to fully release the compression. You can also set this to auto release, which means that the compressor will automatically adjust the release time based on the incoming audio. Okay, we also have this knee. So the knee, let's see what I can do to show you this knee. Okay, you can see there a ratio of 1:1 followed by a ratio of 21:1, so very extreme compression. What the knee does is it softens that bend, that transition from 1:1 ratio up to 21:1 ratio. You can see the knee in action there visually. It's becoming more of a curve. We then have look ahead, 1 millisecond or 10 milliseconds or 0. And that gives your computer time to analyze the signal that's about to come into this compressor, and the compressor can be better prepared. It's almost like the compressor is a human, isn't it? It can be better prepared and ready to start compressing the signal that's about to come into it. We then have linear and logarithmic release. So this toggles the compressor's release between linear and logarithmic. And in log mode, sharply compressed peaks will have a faster release time than less compressed material, and this can result in smoother and less noticeable compression than in lin mode. We then have this makeup switch. With the makeup switch activated, then it's going to automatically compensate the output level as the threshold and ratio values change. And the makeup occurs before the output gain control. So sometimes you may want to turn this off, and you can see visually that this makeup, this whole level of this orange line here drops. With the makeup off, you can then use the output to set the level. We then have these 3 different modes. So there's peak mode, where the compressor responds to short peaks within a signal. So peak mode is what we'd probably use on this sound because we have short peaks. We have RMS mode, which means root mean square. So in this, the compressor is less sensitive to short peaks and it responds more slowly. And then finally we have expand mode, where the compressor acts as an upward expander. So if you have a sound that doesn't have much dynamic range, it doesn't have much of a difference between big spikes and almost silence, more of a continuous sound, and you want to add in more dynamic range to it, then you would probably want to use this expander mode, where basically the output level will increase as the input level exceeds the threshold. So instead of ratios of 4 to 1, 5 to 1, we have ratios of 1 to 5. In this case, the maximum ratio is 1 to 2. So for every 1 decibel you put into it above this threshold, 2 decibels will come out. So this might be very loud. Let's see. See, the gain reduction is going upwards now, and it's blue. So a compressor is a very useful tool indeed. This has been an introduction to compression. And one thing I also want to show you is, in addition to that compressor, we have a device that's quite new to Ableton Live. It was introduced with Live 9. It's called the glue compressor. And this is made by a company called Cytomic. The glue compressor works in a slightly different way. It still has the fundamental concept of compression, but it has this soft click button. And it is said to compress in a very nice way and sound very, very high quality indeed. We have a takt time, release time, ratio. Less control over the ratio compared to our regular compressor. We only have 2 to 1, 4 to 1, and 10 to 1 ratios there. But it is very tasty indeed. The dry wet allows you to control between having no compression to only hearing the compressed signal. And there's a concept of New York compression or parallel compression, where you're hearing both a compressed signal and an uncompressed signal. And this is actually used quite a lot on drums. So what we would do to achieve New York compression is simply set this dry wet signal to something like 50% or somewhere like 40 or 60%. It depends on your taste and the sound that you're working with. But this is going to let through a compressed signal as well as an uncompressed signal. So let's demonstrate that for you. If we set the attack time quite slow, release time is fine there, and have a very high ratio, okay, we're getting some quite heavy compression there, so that's helping to reduce the dynamic range and make the sound seem thicker. This is no compression. Hearing more dynamic range. Full compression, and then New York compression around 50%. So we're getting the best of both worlds. This is the advantage of New York compression or parallel compression. You're hearing a heavily compressed signal as well as an uncompressed signal. So you're hearing the sound still have all of its dynamic range, but also be thickened up. So that's the glue compressor, and you also have that dry wet signal on the compressor, so you can achieve New York or parallel compression with that. And then finally we have the multiband dynamics, which is allowing you to compress different frequency ranges independently of each other. We have 3 bands here, and this is quite a complex device. So I hope that you've enjoyed this tutorial on compression. We've covered EQ and compression now. Those are 2 of the major tools used for mixing in music production. Next we're going to take a look at reverb. See you soon.